Hello, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome all friends and new guests to the 24th episode of BioVerse, where science sparks business in medicines. Today is my great pleasure to have two distinguished guests join me from actually two different remote locations far away from where I sit, New Jersey. And for the new guest and the new audience who have not watched or listened to us before, let me share a little bit of who we are, what is BioVerse. So this is a quick introduction of our background. Hopefully that kind of get you started real quick. Like I said, today this is our 24th episode of a BioVerse. And today we're going to talk about the biotech landscape of Japan and Singapore. I guess, we have a talk about, Asian biotech, especially in China, quite a bit. I think there's a time for us to venture into other major biotech happen today. We really want to focus on Japan and Singapore. A little bit about us, BioVerse, where science sparks business in medicines. It's really was created by three organizations, initially spearheaded by us in Science We Trust community. We are a New Jersey-based nonprofit, really of the Asian biotech, by the Asian biotech, for the Asian biotech. We have over 4,000 active members, and we do BioVerse, as you are listening right now. We have a newsletter of a dozen of social media platform and LinkedIn page. And we also have our second partner, SAPA, Central America Pharmaceutical Professional Associations, Great Philly chapter, not far away from where I stand actually. And we have our last partner, BioSpark, which is a primarily Boston-based nonprofit with a strong focus on R&D of biotech and academia. With that being said, I also want to emphasize, this is really for educational purpose. The speaker's opinion are not really investment suggestions, so don't take that for your investment as an investment advice. And this is really personal opinion, not really represent our organization or our company. All right, with that off the way, now it's my great pleasure to really introduce our speakers. Actually, I would like to invite them to give a little bit introduction of themselves. I think that's probably the best way to understand why we invited this two distinguished speaker with us today. So Patrick, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Leon. So, hi, everyone. My name is Patrick Branch. I'm a partner with LEK Consulting based in Tokyo. I've been with LEK for about over 15 years. And within that 15 years, kind of mixed up with some time spent at AstraZeneca Japan, a Japanese pharma company called Nexera Pharma, and a few other things. So a long-term resident in Japan, but today I am joining you from beside the Mediterranean, which is a lovely place to do a podcast from or a webinar. So thanks, Leon.
Fantastic. I'm very jealous of your location.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Yes. So Jerome, a few words about yourself.
Sure, thanks, Leon. Great to be here today. Jerome Boyd-Kirkup, Chief Scientific Officer and co-founder at Hummingbird Bio. Hummingbird is based in Singapore, and we founded the company here in 2015. So we've been here for 10 years now and still going strong. But I've actually been in Asia working in kind of the biotherapeutic space for 15 years. I came in 2010 for the first time, still with wearing somewhat of an academic hat at that point, but then transitioned into industry about 12 years ago. That was in Shanghai. So 2010 to 2015 was in Shanghai, and then the move to Singapore to kind of set up Hummingbird alongside my co-founder and Hummingbird CEO, Piers Ingram. But prior to that, I was a biochemist and molecular biologist based in the UK before moving out here. But Hummingbird Bioscience is a biotherapeutics company. We develop antibodies and antibody-based therapeutics, largely in the cancer space, although we have moved into other TAs at various times, including, I think, some emerging interest in I&I. And I think that could be a focus for the future. But predominantly, the focus of Hummingbird over the last 10 years has been pushing innovative antibody-based therapeutics for oncology, from discovery through to clinical proof of concept. And we currently have 2 programs in clinical trials at the moment. And we've also made some out-licensing deals over the years as well of some of our drugs. And actually, most recently this year, also out-licensed a large ADC technology platform for dual payload ADCs to a new startup called Calio Therapeutics, that I am also the CSO and co-founder of, which is based in Seattle. So that's it. Brief introduction, but yeah, excited to talk more about kind of the biotech landscape as we see it from Singapore, from our position here in Asia and beyond.
Fantastic. I think this is a really kind of the perfect setup geographically. We have Patrick in Europe, we have Jerome in Asia, and I personally in the US. That's a 3 probably major territory. But we're gonna focus on Japan and Singapore today. But obviously that's a kind of the 3 major player in the global biotech space anyway. With that being off the way, and also a little bit housekeeping reminder, if you have any question during the webinar, please put into the Q&A box. You can find it somewhere. I don't know your screen layout, but put your question over there. Please do include your name and your affiliation, just because there's a lot of compliance issue. We will not take any anonymous questions, just for your awareness. And also, I know this is an impossible time zone, right? So this is probably really too late, too early for some folks. So, we're gonna have a replay, and later on, we're gonna show you a QR code. Once you scan that, you're gonna go to our BioVerse main page. You're gonna see the replay shortly after today's presentation. All right, with those housekeeping introduction off the way, let's dive into the question. So this is really a question Jerome and Patrick and I discussed. We really had a lot of fun. So this is not many, only 6 questions. I think 6 is also kind of a lucky number for Asian culture. That's perfect. So, first of all, I would like to invite, probably start with Patrick, kind of give people overview, the brief history and the status of Japan's biotech industry. So Patrick.
Yeah. I guess thanks, Leon. I'll interpret biotech as kind of biopharma innovation, and my explanation will kind of explain why I've kind of broadly interpreted it. In many ways, if you look at the contribution to global innovation and kind of current pipelines, Japan's biotech environment almost looks like the inverse of everywhere else in the world, or at least other major healthcare markets, in that there is, and there continues to be, a lot of good, almost homegrown or pretty early stage initiated innovation coming out of big companies. So this is a little bit different than what you see elsewhere in the world, where pipelines have essentially dried up from big companies, and they have to look outside to get everything. There is still good stuff coming out of Japanese pharma companies, and I'll just kind of roll off a few examples that are actually quite current. Some that you may be aware of, some that you may not be. So Lilly's oral small molecule GLP-1 candidate that's causing all the news and the share price shifts, that's actually originated from Chugai, which is basically Roche's kind of Japan kind of JV partner, but it's very much a Japanese pharma company that comes out of that company, which is a sizable pharma company. For instance, Ono was critical for the not so much the original invention of Opdivo, but the subsequent kind of advancement of that candidate and eventually bringing that through development and to market. So that's another example. And another one which is pretty current actually is Takeda has an orexin 2 agonist, which I think is probably the hottest thing in the Takeda pipeline right now. That was actually fully homegrown, I think with some academic input perhaps, but that is not, that wasn't acquired from another pharma company in phase 1. That's homegrown Japanese innovation. And that for me is a bit different than what you see elsewhere in the world, where big pharma companies are now almost exclusively sourcing innovation from somewhere else. So that's kind of like one side of the coin when it comes to Japanese biotech innovation, and that's kind of always been there and continues to be there. The other side of the coin is more the biotech scene. So there is a number of biotech companies in Japan. Um, they have kind of waxed and waned over the years. There was a bit of I wouldn't call it a bubble, but a surge of company founding and fundraising, perhaps I think at the end of the 90s and early 2000s. But subsequently, that kind of slowed down, I think, on account of the innovation around which those companies were founded was not so super. The quality of management perhaps wasn't world class. The availability of financing to advance those things further from where they were when they were founded was not sufficient, and perhaps that was associated with risk appetite as well. And so, until fairly recently, the biotech kind of scene, when we basically small companies, was quite stunted, and even stalled in Japan. That's begun to shift and thaw over recent years, and there's been kind of moves in a few areas. So the fundamental underlying basic science has always been there, but I think the quality of the management expertise is slowly shifting, and the ability to shift something from from the bench to something that's eventually put in a real life patient. Management expertise to bring things through preclinical, clinical, commercialization is slowly getting better. And then the availability and risk appetite of capital is also increasing and improving, partly due to kind of government pushes to support that. It's still early days, and that kind of more small company, early stage biotech scene is to be quite frank, still a magnitude or two smaller than what we see in the US and China, for instance. But I'm optimistic, and I think many others are. So we'll see what happens going forward. But that's currently where we are with regards to biotech in Japan. Obviously debatable and discussable, but that's my 40,000-foot view on it.
Yeah, great. I mean, one thing probably also I want to add is like Daiichi, right? Also have the probably one of a
Yep.
lot BD license deal with the Merck. That was
Yeah, they have Enhertu and a few other things. Their ADC platform is obviously very compelling.
correct,
So
correct.
yeah, but there's like Shionogi has an antiviral kind of capability that's partnered with GSK, which has been quite lucrative for them, and there's a few others. I mean, Eisai has been. I mean, there's obviously what they've done there is with partners, but they've been quite instrumental in bringing through novel Alzheimer's disease therapies as well.
Wow, fantastic. I think, wow, that's already quite interesting, right? People think like
Yeah, it's
the
different.
big pharma
Yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
innovate, and it turned out the Japanese big pharma actually they are really functioning like a biotech. They are like an R&D engine, like an early
yeah.
innovation engine. That's quite interesting. So, Jerome, a little bit the overview of Singapore.
Sure. Well, Singapore is a much smaller country than Japan, so I think we have to give it some credit for what it's achieved over the years, and also it's a much newer biotech ecosystem, I think, than many countries. The first forays into building a biotech ecosystem kind of happened really in the turn of the millennium, around 2000, when it became a strategic push for the Singapore government to kind of invest in building up not simply just an academic kind of a university innovation machine, but actually an innovation machine targeted towards industrial innovation in the biotech space, and that led to the creation of what is called in Singapore Biopolis, which was now the headquarters of the Association of Science and Technology and Research, which was kind of founded alongside kind of the Economic Development Board of Singapore, really to be an industrial innovation machine. So specifically to, I guess, come up with technologies, therapeutics, diagnostics that could be spun out and set into kind of early stage companies. The focus I feel in Singapore has always been kind of hand in hand with big pharma presence in Singapore, as well as big pharma manufacturing. So actually big pharma manufacturing, which was also kind of a push at the same time, has done incredibly well through a number of initiatives. The government has attracted a lot of the big pharmas to do manufacturing in Singapore, and it's an incredibly lucrative space for them to run plants. They may not be the biggest, but it's at least from what I've heard, it's some of the best performing plants that these guys have around the world. Again, not really my area, but all I say is that particular sector seems to be going from strength to strength. And I think over the last few years, even in the post-COVID world, there's been big name investments, of people like Biotech and Moderna in building new plants in Singapore. So, that's still quite strong. I think when we look at then like the other side, the early stage startup. So as I said, it is the intent was it for it to both emerge from the existing academic sector, but also from these kind of association of science, technology, research, more industrial innovation hubs. And I think that has been happening. But how many of them have been turned into companies and where do those companies go, I think has been an evolving strategy for Singapore. I think there was one intent back in the day to go hand in hand with the biomanufacturing of the farmers for them to also put R&D plants in Singapore to kind of educate, I guess, the talent base in Singapore to do, more early stage, mid stage, late stage development of drugs, and then to help that talent pool to be developing some of the homegrown innovations. But as I think we've all seen over the last kind of 20 years, pharma have gone from a dispersed R&D model back to a consolidated R&D model. And I feel like, with bar a couple of exceptions, actually Chugai does have an R&D site in Singapore, and I think MSD, Merck, we would call US Merck as opposed to European Merck, also has a small site. But others have had sites that have then just retracted. So I think we went up, but just in the couple of years before Hummingbird started, there was about 10 startups that were operational in Singapore. In 2023, that number was officially 65. Now I feel both due to the challenging biotech environment, it's down to around 50. But also I think there's been some successes of companies. But unfortunately, I think, and we could talk more about, how Singapore works, the success of some companies has taken those companies out of Singapore. So, I think Singapore is still trying to develop that a strategic initiative that allows kind of end-to-end company development in the biotech ecosystem, kind of the companies spinning out, starting up, innovating, creating new drugs, and then taking them all the way through. In fact, the only drugs that have been approved that came out of Singapore are actually coming out of big pharma when they were here. In fact, Chugai, I think, is one of the few, one of the programs that they developed here. Crovalimab was the first FDA approved drug to come out of Singapore. So again, I think there's so much we could talk about, and I think we'll touch on it with some of the other questions that I know, Leon, you had there. But I hope that that's a little bit of an overview about where Singapore is today. And I think the only other thing to talk about, and again, we can talk about it, is what's changed for startups to make Singapore either better or worse over the years for startups. But maybe we can come back to that as we get into those other questions.
I think that's a really good kind of stage setting for the audience, especially. I mean, I have to be honest with my ignorance. I don't know so much about the tool market, but now I learned so much already. But now let's get a little bit into the weights, right? Let's look at this probably from the 3 dimensions. The first one is really a landscape or regulation, policy, and government reimbursement support, right? That's really kind of macro factors for the tool market. Probably, again, I would invite Patrick to start. Well, by the way, I mean, if you Jerome, you have any question, feel free to ask Patrick, because you probably want to learn about what's going on with Japan. Probably want to explore over there as well. So I want to make this really interactive. And also for the audience, don't be shy. Put your question over there. This is a tool super duper expert of the tool market. You don't find people like this very often. So do take advantage of them. All right, please, Patrick, what do you think about landscape, regulation, policies, and government reimbursement in Japan?
So I'll begin with policy. So at a high level, I think the policy, there's a few, I think the policy goals of government at large when it comes to biopharma in Japan are kind of twofold. One is to create a more nurturing environment for early stage startups and for translation of kind of innovation from academia to kind of the commercial setting. And the other is to make Japan a more attractive end market for innovative therapies and to provide access for Japan patients to world-class healthcare. And then there's a kind of a tension there with how does that get paid for? And I guess the first goal is actually kind of aligned with kind of broader economic goals of the country, in that, you know, if we have a healthy startup ecosystem, that can only be a good thing because that's going to create jobs and create wealth, etc. It's more the second goal, which creates tension with kind of other parts of government, in that innovation at kind of at the market level, when people actually have to pay for it, means paying less for other stuff. And so there's a bit of a tension between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Finance about how much to pay and for what, which I guess is similar to other markets in the world. And actually, I think is a little bit more benign than many other markets in the world, in that there is a little bit more consensus that Japan should provide world-class healthcare, and it's not prepared to rationalize care and access perhaps as much as European cousins maybe are willing to do. So that's kind of the broad policy landscape. And just going back to the innovation part there and the early stage startup piece, there is, I mean, there's been quite a push and a lot of money made available to support venture capital and investment, as well as to encourage greater kind of spin out technologies from universities as well, which is slowly kind of having an impact on innovation and startup foundation, etc., which is good to see. Just going into the regulatory and the reimbursement part, which kind of supports bringing stuff through the clinic and then providing an attractive market at the end of that. I think from a regulatory perspective, Japan has a somewhat ill-earned reputation as being a difficult market. There are some things which are different and additional to other markets, but generally the regulatory regime is quite harmonized. And there are some, I wouldn't call them shortcuts, but kind of fast track routes to market. So, you know, the ability perhaps to skip some phase 1 steps if you have, you know, compelling data from overseas patients. That means it may not be necessary. The ability to get conditional approval for regenerative medicine and such. So there are some nice bits there and some nice programs that help people get things to market quicker. And then this may also not be appreciated, but there is there's a general pragmatism of the regulator to basically pharma companies looking to, you know, obviously appropriately balance trade-offs between how much clinical work they do and the kind of the cost and speed considerations around that. And in partnership with pharma companies, the regulator is often willing to discuss innovative regulatory pathways and clinical study designs and such. And so people explore that, others don't. But that's kind of an interesting thing about Japan that may be underappreciated. Just a final point on reimbursement. So I guess break that down into two pieces: access and pricing. Access is actually, I mean, I think really world-class in Japan, in that you can get a drug approved, 3 months later you have a price, and effectively the drug is available to everyone in the country thereafter. So you don't have the fragmentation that we see in Europe and the United States, where you have to go country by country or state by state to get reimbursement, negotiate with different payer types, etc. You know, once you're approved, once you're priced, for the most part, everyone can get it. There may be some, you know, restrictions and limitations around certain therapies, but that's generally the rule, which is unusual and also, I think, quite compelling. And then pricing, I guess it tends to be kind of in the middle of the pack of what you would see in Europe. So it's not at the kind of the extremes that we see in the United States, but still isn't bad. And then there's the slight benefit that gross to net is not such a big adjustment as, say, the US, in that we don't have a complicated kind of web of PBMs and private payers and other intermediaries in the mix in Japan that kind of each take their little cut. So you know, the reimbursement price and the ex-manufacturer price are not too dissimilar at the end of the day. So I think, you know, my take is policy landscape, regulatory landscape, reimbursement landscape. I mean, I'm not going to kind of say they're easy, but they are still navigable, and I think on a world basis, you know, pretty reasonable and for the most part attractive.
Fantastic. So, Jerome?
Sure. So I think I have a slightly different perspective, because I think, as I introduced, Singapore is a smaller country, and therefore really, you know, I don't think there's any Singapore companies in biotech who are focused on the Singapore market as their reason for being. I mean, it's very nice, and I think, like, of course, all of us working in the ecosystem here, as well as the government, want benefit to Singapore patients, but that comes by successful global development of a drug and getting access into larger markets. You know, the US, China, Europe, even Japan. You know, that's got to be the focus, and it is, of Singapore biotech. So in terms of the regulations and the policy, I mean, that is really the front and center in the mind of Singapore, is to make sure that those regulations and that policy aligns with that global strategy. The Singapore drugs must be developable and marketable for a global patient base. And so, you know, both when it comes to regulatory environment, in terms of regulation around preclinical research, you know, we have to be doing the research into, you know, laboratory animals. All has to be done at a very high level so that it is, you know, acceptable for submission into, you know, US FDA or the China NMPA for, you know, submission of new investigational drug applications into those countries. But then from the clinical perspective, because Singapore does want to be an important site in clinical research, the Health and Sciences Authority of Singapore, which is kind of the equivalent to the FDA or the NMPA in Singapore, is very, very much aligned with the US FDA and you know, I think increasingly to NMPA. So there should be a seamless kind of movement of clinical data amongst those ecosystems, of course, with an eye on the genetic background and the ethnicity of the patients for later stage approvals. But, you know, Singapore should be able to be used for all of those jurisdictions. So then when we consider kind of what help, I'm interpreting reimbursement in terms of the government, you know, what is the government helping to reimburse in terms of the biotech R&D that's going on in Singapore, so that we can kind of look ahead to some of those questions on kind of why Singapore. Singapore does have a very supportive government. So the regulations around setting up companies, setting up startups, you know, getting those companies off the ground is very favorable. It's very smooth, it makes a lot of sense, and it's not onerous in terms of paperwork, at least at the early stage. Then there are grants available from government to support various stages of especially startup in the early years for companies, and definitely, you know, Hummingbird has benefited from that. We really appreciate that support from the very earliest stage, and actually we're still getting you know, some very useful support right now from government agencies, the EDBI, Economic Development Board, as well as the Enterprise Singapore, which is kind of a business support agency in Singapore. I think just because Patrick touched on it, you know, but I think it's also something that will come back to the funding environment. I think, you know, Singapore is again considering regulations around making the flow of capital around the world move into Singapore easily, as well as innovation, I think, move out of Singapore. So those things are being supported at the very highest level of government. And in fact, I think what's been nice to see as a company in Singapore is where certain countries maybe are pulling back on some of the investments into early stage R&D in potentially a challenging environment for investment. Singapore has been doubling down. Their most recent announcement was kind of like their 2025 investment into R&D was, I think it was, something like the big number was something like 25 billion, of which probably 4 million is coming into, really innovative kind of biotech. So there's continued support and real money going in from Singapore government to help drive biotech companies through.
Great. I think that's really, really helpful. Now, let's get into I would argue the most interesting topic is R&D, right? The cost, innovation, how innovative are we? How much expense going to be for the biotech, primary function R&D versus other territory, if you can do a little bit compare and contrast. Again, so probably Patrick, you want to start with this one?
Yeah. So just on the innovativeness, I think, as I mentioned, the machine of big Japanese pharma, from kind of invention through to the commercialization, I mean, depends on the company, but generally kind of works in that you've got the kind of the scientific creation, you've got the management and technical skills to bring something through all the way to market, you've got capital and you've got risk appetite, and that piece works. On the kind of more biotech, small company, VC funded side of things, this is improving, as I mentioned, but still it's early days. And it's really the kind of the pieces of, I mean, the invention is there, but the technical and management skills to get something through the clinic onto the market and to engage also with financial stakeholders is still emerging. And then kind of connected to that, that kind of makes things a little bit difficult to invest in if they're not being really positioned as investable assets. And then therefore the kind of existence of VC funding and risk appetite is not perhaps as strong, even though the government is trying to juice that up with some quite attractive funding for the sector. So the innovativeness of the ecosystem, particularly on the smaller side of companies, is still work in progress. Just on the costs, I think it's fair to say employee costs are quite reasonable in Japan. And maybe if we were having this conversation 40 years ago, you would have thought, wow, they're super expensive. But I think salaries are pretty much stayed close to where they were like 40 years ago. There hasn't been a strong appreciation in salaries, and then there's been a depreciation in the yen over the last 3-4 years. So hiring in Japan can be pretty reasonable. So that side of the cost equation is probably quite competitive for the skills and experience that you're getting. I think doing the kind of the preclinical and clinical costs not related to personnel, but maybe what you're paying vendors and kind of sites and whatnot, that tends to be, I think, relatively expensive. And maybe just on costs, one thing I've noticed is, and this probably relates to the risk appetite of these pharma companies. The cost of capital is actually quite low in Japan, so you can, the Bank of Japan rate on a 10-year treasury note is very low, and that translates into a low cost of capital for at least for companies based in Japan. So there is a lower cost of capital that exists here as well. But when you add in all the risk and whatnot, maybe if you're a VC, you probably have a similar rate elsewhere in the world. But maybe for a Japanese pharma company, it's less than, say, a US pharma company. So that means they can fund more stuff.
Great. Jerome, anything?
Definitely. No, it's very interesting, Patrick, to hear your take on Japan. I think from
a land of contradictions.
For Singapore,
yeah.
Some of the things you said, I heard some similarities with Singapore. I think there are some differences. I think, I've I'm now been involved in running biotech companies both in the US and Singapore. I think, you know, Hummingbird has actually had offices in the US. We run US operations. Now we have a full US kind of, or at least predominantly US. We flipped it, predominantly US company with Calio, but although we do have some Singapore employees with that company as well. But we've recently opened a Shanghai office as well. So we're also, you know, with Hummingbird doing operations in China. So I get a little bit of kind of on the ground and real numbers. So I think, you know, overall, the cost of people and the cost of talent in Singapore is very favorable compared to the US, and is, I would have said, on par with the US in terms of, you know, mid-level to senior level talent. I think that the kind of the PhD postdoc level, more junior career professionals are probably more cost effective in China than they are in Singapore, and Singapore is definitely more cost effective than the US. So, you know, overall, I would put kind of Singapore somewhere, you know, in overall operations costs between the US and in China. So and we can talk more about the advantages that you get from that slightly higher cost of doing business compared to China and lower cost compared to the US. But we'll just continue, because it's on this point 3 rather than moving on to point 4 and talking fundings per se, but it's on talent and innovation. You know, we like to say that Singapore is full of raw talent. I think, you know, it's been a pleasure working here for 10 years. We've built a really fantastic team. You know, but because it's a younger biotech ecosystem and there's less opportunities to kind of nurture the talent through kind of on-the-job industry training, you know, the companies themselves are doing a lot of the training as we go along, and you know, we've had fantastic success on that. And as I said, you know, it's been a pleasure working with people from, you know, who are products of the Singapore education and innovation ecosystem, and they're thriving, I think, at Hummingbird. But it is a difference to maybe both the US ecosystem as well as the China ecosystem, where I feel like the flux of talent it means that you know, there's a lot more experience, a lot more maybe, you know, nurtured, experienced talent in those places. And so I'm not sure, Patrick, how you feel like the talent and its cyclical motion in Japan. Is there, I know you kind of mentioned it in I think your very early points, but you know, how does that compare with what I just said about Singapore?
So if we think about like the kind of archetypal Chinese biotech founder, they would have often have done a PhD postdoc in the US, maybe spent time with a big pharma in the US, returned to Japan, and returned to China and established a biotech company. And then probably on the finance side as well, you would have a similar kind of cyclical migration of people working in Goldman Sachs or somewhere in the US, and then, you know, coming back to China and working in a VC. And they would have been exposed to all of the great stuff that the US has to offer in terms of invention and taking risk and raising capital, etc. And that's obviously, I mean, obviously there's great invention, which is obviously indigenous to China, but there's been that kind of fertilization of skills has obviously been beneficial, right? Because if I look at the management team of any Chinese biotech, the archetype is clearly there. For Japanese biotechs, we don't see that. So the typical founder of a Japanese biotech is somebody that usually has been successful in a big Japanese company or in the subsidiary of a big multinational, has got close to retirement age, has enough money to kind of feel comfortable with life and taking a bit of risk, and decide, and maybe has a few friends who are professors in Tokyo University or something, have something interesting, they decide to set up a biotech company. And that results in quite a different skill set in the management between a typical Chinese biotech and a typical Japanese biotech, but also just in terms of the hunger and the urgency to kind of advance something. you know, for the Chinese biotech, it's kind of like all hands to the pump kind of thing. And for a Japanese biotech, and I'm just generalizing here, and I know there's exceptions to what I'm saying. You know, it's a bit of more of a leisurely pursuit, and you know, months can turn into years, can turn into decades, and not much has been done. So that from that perspective, I think that's a fundamental thing. If I go to raw, the scientific talent pool, I think there are, it's actually increasing. There's a lot of good people that have worked in big Japanese pharma companies that are coming up against kind of restructurings and voluntary retirement programs. So you do have quite a lot of good raw scientific talent that can be used to support biotechs here. And that's often, and sorry to kind of say in these terms, but quite reasonably priced talent compared to the US. So the raw muscle is there, but I feel like the quality of leadership, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but just doesn't have some of those kind of what I feel are fundamental ingredients for entrepreneurial scientific endeavor that you see in China and I presume Singapore as well.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. And I think that, you know, for Singapore's side, there's definitely, I think, a need for both the returning talent that's been from Singapore, as well as as new talent coming in, but alongside, I think, the developing and rapidly developing homegrown talent ecosystem that is, you know, fully kind of been a part of the Singapore ecosystem all along. So yeah, exciting times ahead, I think.
Yeah, I guess like you know, sounds like you know. I always joke and tell people ask me what do I describe biotech industry? Because it's like a semiconductor can always pinpoint sound like let's say there's like a big machine right make by ASML. That's a kind of like technical barrier. You have a chalk point, but for biotech, I always tell people I could be wrong. Please correct me. I always tell people this is a highly educated, labor intensive industry.
Yeah.
Right. So that's, you know, if you have to start with a huge group of a highly educated labor, then they have to work a lot. So, you know, I think the hunger is real. I mean, I know China about it very well. So I saw a lot of, I would say, younger generation, definitely young in the biotech industry, in their, I would say, mid 30s, right? Mid, like, you know, early 40s. Right now, they are running biotech as a CEO. Actually, publicly traded biotech in China. It's quite amazing, right? This is sounds like a previous generation compared to probably the typical Japanese biotech CEO, right? So they have very different trajectory. So with that in
Yeah.
mind, I guess the next question going to be really relevant. I think Patrick and Jerome will touch on this. So, you know, this kind of, especially you are talking about the financing, right? Like the funding environment, that's you know, that's absolutely global, right? And the US dominant, and China is catching up. So in that kind of background, obviously the US and China, they are really like busting their heads in terms of you know, one want to keep their lead position, China want to catch up in terms of in the biotech space. In that, you know, as a backdrop, how would you describe the funding environment, the geopolitical, you know, features really influence your individual biotech local market?
So I think for earlier stage, and then so I'm actually more of a business person than a scientist, so I use some kind of like quite crude words like stuff. But for early
So
stage
this is the
stuff,
factor. This is the factor. That's exactly what for me.
but for early stage stuff, there is sufficient, I believe, sufficient funding and risk appetite to kind of get things through preclinical into early stage clinical development. What I see, and this is changing, but typically once people need to go big, they get to phase 2, phase 3 stage, they need to go to the US to basically raise the money, and that often means that they have to kind of shift the operations from Japan to the US, and the company begins to look a little bit different than it once did. So kind of large scale funding, people willing to put tens of millions of dollars at risk for one trial. That's still something that I think people, like generally the investor community in Japan, struggles a little bit with. And then just on the geopolitical side of things, I tried to connect it, but it's a bit difficult. But I mean, Japan is obviously proximal to the geopolitical tensions, but in and of itself is I mean, it has kind of political ups and downs, but they tend to be fairly benign. And touch wood, won't kind of go the direction of even what we see in places like the UK and France, for instance. It has a pretty benign and predictable kind of internal political environment. So in terms of external macro stuff that can go wrong that might worry investors, Japan is a pretty good place. It's more the specificities of the biotech ecosystem that probably make people think twice.
Great,
Yeah, and I
Jerome.
think for Singapore, many of the same things are true, but I think it's probably even more of a challenge because, again, with the size, Singapore needs to, and Singapore startup and innovation needs to attract cross-border investment. And I think we have definitely been, welcome recipients of the cross-border investment historically, both from China, from the US, from Europe, from Singapore-based investors. So and that when it works well. And I think this, as Patrick said, I think Singapore is kind of the same. People don't mind investing in Singapore, but it's about the risk of the investment. And I think as the biotech capital has become much more challenging to get over the last few years, I think there's been much less appetite for cross-border investments, which seem inherently, perhaps not truthfully, but seem inherently, I think, to a lot of the investors as more risky than investing in your own backyard, where you can keep an eye on where your money's going, right? If you're investing in a guy who's in another country, you even if it's a solid investment, it's just a bit more of an unknown, a bit more of a risk. So I think for Singapore, there is good support for early stage spin out, seed, startup, especially with what Singapore can kind of rustle up itself with both the grants system and some of the Singapore dedicated investment arms of things like Temasek and other kind of Singapore linked entities, like the Economic Development Board has its own investment arm and something like that. We've definitely benefited from that. That's fantastic. But where you need to start attracting cross-border, it becomes challenging, and I think it's becoming much more challenging to fund the preclinical to clinical jump. And definitely, even if you do fund that, which we have done in the past, it's even more difficult than it's ever been to fund the next bit, which I think, as Patrick said, has historically required a lot more money and has regularly taken companies outside of, I guess, a smaller ecosystem into a bigger ecosystem to seek out that large money. So again, we've been very fortunate to, over the years, attract that cross-border investment, but it has not been an easy feat, and I think it's becoming more of a challenge as the geopolitical tensions kind of flare up. So yeah, it's a good ish funding environment. I wish it was better. And I think we've benefited from Singapore's position in that neutral zone between kind of Western, Eastern, European, American, geopolitics, and it will continue to toe, I think, that fine line of neutrality, which allows it to kind of attract investment from all over the place, as long as people in those places with money are willing to invest.
Fantastic. Wow, that's a lot of information. And it's like, the two like kind of elephant in the room, right? The US and China looks like they kind of once you reach like a late stage, you have to pick one of them. I mean, most of them still pick US, but I think China trying to attract and keep most of their, late stage company to themselves, close to their chest. Well, that's all the three kind of specific question we have. Now, the last one is, something probably really for you. You're gonna be a, temporary ambassador of of the biotech market of either Japan and Singapore. So what's most overlooked advantage of each market versus other Asian biotech companies, especially, I mean, everyone talk about China. I think I'm a little bit tired of it. So there must be something, right? So if you could, Patrick, probably want to start compared to other Asian biotech hub,
Yeah.
the unique one.
So I would say one is that that track record that we touched upon at the beginning, Leon, of homegrown innovation that was invented in Japan but has made it all the way to multi-billion-dollar drug or dollar selling drugs, which are used by patients globally. Japan has generated that and can continue to generate that. So it is this home of great research. So if you can unlock that, that's great. And I think that that's, I wouldn't say necessarily that the US and China don't have that, but Japan has it as well, and probably disproportionately so, given it's, you know, a bit of a smaller place than those two big elephants, as you described them.
Yeah, so actually, in my opinion, I think from commercial, like revenue contribution wise, Japan's clear the number 3, right, in the world. China's by far distant, a distant number 4, right?
Yep.
If you look at the revenue contribution, don't forget the number 1 by market cap company, Henry, their revenue just a fraction compared to Kida or Daiichi, right? So it's on the late stage, they're not a meaningful player, and also Japan have way more Nobel Prize winners. Right, have a way more, like you said, late stage drugs, mega blockbuster drug, not just like a blockbuster, it's a mega blockbuster drug. Like orforglipron, like you mentioned, I remember at some point the analysts believe orforglipron originated from Chugai, probably have like up to 40 billion peak sale. It's kind of
I bet Roche has kicked, well, I'm sure they kicked themselves long ago, but yeah.
Yes. So I want to get people a little bit don't get too carried away by the headline. We're a bunch of like people really focus on number. If you read like a hard number, revenue, profit, Japan is number 1 clearly in Asia. So Jerome, what's the most overlooked advantage of Singapore as a biotech market?
Well, I've got 2 points. I guess the first one is for a biotech company, and the second one will be for a biotech professional working in Singapore. I think for the first one, for a company in Singapore, I think the connectivity that Singapore has with the world, and it's multifaceted. It's connectivity in terms of, how easy it is to fly around the world with Singapore as a hub, but it's also, the position that Singapore has in the node of global business, which makes, there's a lot of movement of business through Singapore, makes it very easy to work, as I said, both in China, in the US, in other ecosystems. The connectivity of language, for those who don't know, Singapore has 4 official languages. English is kind of the business language, but, English, Mandarin, Bahasa, and Tamil are the 4 official languages. And, realistically, the top 2 are the ones that matter, I think, in the biotech zone. And, we have, not personally, but, a very bilingual company where people can easily operate in both Chinese as well as English, and so we can work within those 2 ecosystems very effectively. I think where it comes to, again, another advantage is the very strong business and intellectual property regulations that exist in Singapore. I think that's helped attract funding in, because those are very well respected, and the IP that comes out and the strength of that IP is respected. So when we consider out licensing, it's normally, at least historically, has been considered very strong. And then I guess just to wrap up with a personal advantage, as a biotech professional, Singapore has very favorable personal advantages, pretty competitive tax environment. I think, personal tax kind of caps out at the very, very highest level at about 22%. And, there's no capital gains tax either. So this is it's an attractive place to base yourself as a biotech professional and operate, as I said, in kind of a global, even bilateral, but increasingly global biotech ecosystem.
Jerome, the top tax bracket in Japan for personal income tax is 55%. So
wow.
Yeah. But I get the satisfaction of paying for all of that innovation. So there you go.
So Patrick probably can continue. What's your advice for your peers, like pharma,
Yeah.
biotech investment community to access the Japanese market, biotech market?
So for
I mean, they should
MNCs,
talk to you, obviously. They're gonna
yeah,
ask
yeah. Come
for
and
email.
talk to me, and yeah, that would be great. But so for multinationals, so I mean, I interpret this more as Japan as a market for innovation discovered elsewhere, or potentially in Japan as well. But Japan, I think, is a large market. It is a accessible market, is a profitable market for innovation. So I see companies like Argenx and Insmed, and also bigger companies like Novartis and the like. They do very well here. They find a willing market and attractive marketplace for innovation. So and it's obviously relatively politically benign and a stable place. So I think come here, and it's a good marketplace for investors and executives more on the biotech side. I think believe in the underlying science. I think believe that there's strong talent here. Be aware of maybe some of the limitations, particularly around senior talent as it relates to kind of startups, and that would be both on the kind of strategic and management side as well as the financial side. There's going to be some things you have to navigate and some gaps you need to anticipate there if you wish to fully exploit Japan's potential. But the underlying science is there, so you have to go and look for it. But and things are getting better from a talent perspective and a financing perspective as well. And again, come and speak to me. I hope.
Of course. So one quick question for you. For people really want to embrace this this market, if they don't speak Japanese, how big an issue that could be?
Oof. So, I mean, it's better if you speak Japanese. So, I speak so Japanese. It's obviously a lot easier for me to interact in English as we're doing today. I think if you don't know Japan and you don't know Japanese and you're beginning from scratch, it can be a little bit tough to kind of navigate that cold without help. So I mean, people obviously come here and don't speak Japanese, and that's why here I'm actually not in Japan today, but they come to Japan and are successful. I think also it requires not only the language but also the culture. People who don't know anything about Japan but come with a kind of a modest perspective and a humble perspective and the willingness to learn and listen and not jump to conclusions and come with a bit of patience, they do well. Say, for example, British people, and then people who come with kind of preconceived notions of how things should be, and want those things done yesterday and are prepared to shout and fight to make those things happen. They tend to struggle a bit because they just fall on in a bad situation in Japan. And so you come with the right attitude, and even if there is a linguistic gap, you can still be successful.
All right, fantastic. Jerome, what's your invite to the people? They should
I think,
talk to you as well. I guess they should definitely talk to you as well.
Yeah, definitely talk to me and reach out and find me on LinkedIn or something. I think Singapore is open for business, and I think that both means from if you want to move as a biotech professional, if you want to move as a small company looking for a home, or if you want to move to find innovation and take it either into a startup or build a venture-backed company behind it. Singapore has all of those, and it's a very easy place to get involved in. The government agencies are incredibly supportive, and that includes support when you just reach out as somebody from a different ecosystem and want to know more about Singapore and what it can provide. Who should you speak to? Enterprise Singapore is a great kind of on-ramp for working in Singapore, and also can, you know, help understand kind of the on-ramps in terms of visas to work in Singapore, and it's a fairly smooth process. I think it may be challenging and increasingly challenging in certain areas which are less open for business, less open for kind of people, you know, coming to a country if they weren't from there. Singapore is definitely welcoming to that. And I think, you know, there's plenty of innovation here. There's innovation here crying out for, you know, experienced biotech professionals to come and play their part in taking these innovations to the next stage, and, you know, partnering and out licensing into the global ecosystem. So I hope that's a sales pitch enough and has attracted some people to at least consider Singapore. It's done us incredibly well over the last 10 years, and I hope more great both biotech professionals but also companies are based here in Singapore in the coming years.
All right, fantastic. We could probably gonna run over like 3 minutes. I promise you I will not delay for too much because of the three very good questions. So the first one actually come from Naveen. He has two questions. I think I can combine them together. So Naveen's Sok, sorry if I butcher your name, I apologize. He have two questions. The first part is could Singapore and Japan pair up with other Asian market together to become a regional biotech hub to rival against China? So to you both. What's your take? You should make friends first, and you work with the team, and then
I would say that would be a huge challenge, right? Merging the cultures of Asia together is not as easy as it sounds.
Sure.
As well as the flow of capital and where that capital is, and what's
Mhm.
the appetite even of the investors in certain you know, regions. I would love for that to happen, but I think, you know, having a more diversified ecosystem where people understand what is Singapore's strengths, what is Japan's strengths, what is, you know,
Right.
other countries' strengths, and being able to, you know, as I said, work it, you know, in previous responses, work as part of this global biotech development ecosystem.
Right.
And take advantage of the strengths that all countries have. I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, I guess I come from a somewhat similar perspective. I mean, there is some flow of capital back and forth, right? I mean, the kind of the prize at the end of the day is often the US market, right? So the natural kind of point of engagement and collaboration usually kind of looks towards the US at some point, when it seems that you need to have people there doing stuff, or you need a lot of capital from there. But I mean, there's a lot of history also in Asia, right, which can make some of those things a little bit difficult, as we all know. But it sounds like a nice idea, and I guess
Mm-hmm.
hopefully the barriers will come down, and things will harmonize, and there will be greater collaboration going forward.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't bet on that being a big thing in the near term.
Yeah, I think the strength of China has been the number of people, right? And people breeds capital, people breeds, you know, and a centralized system, or somewhat centralized kind of regulatory system and market. That's again, it's challenging to do with so many different countries at play.
Yeah,
Right.
I would say just on that point, I mean, we see a lot of Chinese capital being interested in Japan right now, and less on the risk side of things, but on the later stage and kind of commercial side of things. So there may be a bigger role for China to play going forward. So maybe Chinese capital markets and such being an alternative to the US for Japanese innovation.
Yeah, I want to add on that. Actually, yesterday, Jerome and I were talking. There's at least one, probably a few more. A Singapore originated biotech life science company. They went IPO in Hong Kong, right? So that's kind of exactly like Patrick you said, right? You probably saw some private capital go to Japan, but there's
Yeah,
there's serious kind of competition of a Hong Kong stock exchange as a
yep,
in place for biotech, right?
yep,
Versus Nasdaq or like London. So that's definitely people keep in mind. Another thing for especially our Western audience, there's a huge economic kind of free trade zone, if you may, called RECP, right? Regional Economic Comprehensive Partnership. Actually, all those major potential Asian countries are part of it, right? If I'm not mistaken, Japan is a part of it as well. So unless people started something, they want to build something without kind of a partner together rival China, actually China is one of them. But you know, like you said, you know, unfortunately, there's some war, there's some kind of a friction among the Asian countries. They are not a big happy family. They don't even
But
speak
maybe
language.
I would say, I mean, I guess in the world of semiconductors, for instance, there might be a clearer division of labor between different markets, right? So Japan does quality, Korea does one thing, Taiwan does the other thing, Singapore does something else. If there's a clear division of labor, maybe it's kind of innovation, manufacturing, clinical development, then I can imagine some kind of geographic collaborative system emerging, but I don't
Right.
quite see it as cleanly in biotech as I do with semiconductors.
Yeah. So this is the last. Sorry, Jerome, you have something to add, please.
No, I agree.
No, so then the last question. So this one for Alex Wang actually is a friend. We know each other fairly well. So definitely have a pick your question, Alex. I'm doing you a favor. It's for Patrick. So
Uh,
Patrick, you have mentioned that Japan does not have a robust biotech sector as US and China, but its biotech industry will become more dynamic in the future. Could you please elaborate a bit more why its biotech sector is underdeveloped now and why you believe in the future will be more robust? For Alex.
yeah, first of all, just some data or kind of allusions to data because I don't have the data to hand. But if you look at things like, I think company creation, but also fundraising, transaction volumes, etc., like by general measures of a biotech cluster's kind of productivity, like Japan is quite far below the US and China. So that kind of is what it is, and probably not too hard to find the specific data there. Why has it been like that? I think and part of it is a little bit is like Japan is a Goldilocks, not quite a Goldilocks country. It looks like a Goldilocks country, but it's kind of like big but not big enough, but people think it is big enough, so people focus on the local market, but then it turns out it's not enough, and then that plays out kind of from the perspective of talent, from the availability of capital, and then the kind of the size of the end market. So I think historically people have thought a bit too small, and that hasn't panned out to produce kind of successful biotech companies. So from a management perspective, and a leadership and a talent perspective, the entrepreneurial talent just hasn't been there. From a capital perspective and a risk-taking perspective, it also hasn't had sufficient capital and risk. And then the end market is okay, but it's not the US. So if you don't develop for the global marketplaces, you may not get a return as well. How is that all changing? I'm simplifying in a very gross and terrible way, but how's that changing? I think talent is slowly upgrading. That's a little bit because I wouldn't say there's the same kind of highway of talent between Japan and the US that there is between China and the US, but people are becoming more aware of kind of what it takes to build an ecosystem and what it takes to be successful in venture and such. There's more funding coming in. So this is both private funding, but also public funding through, I mean, the government has a matching kind of a fund allocated, and they provide a match to VC funding of 2 times for things that qualify, which is great. And I think people, it kind of relates to the management point. I think leadership of companies now are thinking about, well, how do I take what I'm doing global? How do I think about the global opportunity in terms of the business decisions that I'm making, in terms of the clinical plan, etc. And that's making for more compelling companies to invest in. And that's taking time, but I think what it's going to produce is more capital to invest in more investable companies than has been the case in the past.
Wow, fantastic. I feel like our conversation getting better and better, but we have to end now. I just feel like, a little bit disappointed in that sense. But,
Yeah.
I'm, people, if you want to continue conversation, please reach out to Patrick and Jerome on LinkedIn or shoot us an email. You know our email address. If you don't know, actually, here we go. That's our email address. I'll share this with you. Also, leave your advertisement. That's what we have in our pipeline in the remaining reminder of this year, 3 more episode for special sponsors. Look at this, pretty impactful, going to be very interesting for the audience. So if you are interested in sponsor or become title sponsor or even send a speaker to us, please contact us on the email below and also visit us in Science Trust Community, our website right there. So just a little bit more about us, in addition to the BioVerse, that's our flagship program. We also have a newsletter, a pretty successful newsletter, actually one of the most influential newsletter in this industry. Very high number of open rate. If you're in market here, that's quite insane. It's almost 80% open rate. And we also have a lot of a community, primarily on WeChat, also on LinkedIn, also on WhatsApp. With that being said, I don't want to further delay. Patrick, it's time to have a little bit of drink over there, lovely ocean. And Jerome's time to go to bed. Thank you both so much. And learned so much today. I'm pretty sure it's just a starting point for me to continue to learn this too exciting Asian biotech market. And for the audience, thank you very much. And we'll see you next time very soon.
Thanks, Leon.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Take care.